Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, greetings. I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and you can go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes, and you'll definitely want to check out the show notes for today's episode. There's going to be quite a few links that I'm going to go through, and this is the first podcast when I'm recording the episode without a guest, trying out a new format. And in late 2017, I noticed that the Microsoft community didn't have as many outlets for DevOps conversations as the Linux community did, and I wanted to make a difference. And so in December of 2017, I started the Microsoft DevOps User Group, which now, with September coming around, when the rebranding of VSTS to Azure DevOps, I renamed that to the Azure DevOps User Group. And so you can go on meetup.com and just search for that. And then in September 2018, I also launched this podcast, the Azure DevOps Podcast. And I've been kind of passionate about this for a while. Back in 2006, which, well, that's over 12 years ago. I think that's when it was. I was a founding board member of a group called Agile Austin, which is still going strong and hosts an annual conference of almost 1,000 people. And man, that's been a really fun journey. And I also led the Austin.NET user group for about 5 years a while back, and founded the Azure Austin Group. And if you can't tell by now, I live in Austin, Texas. And going back to 2005, I've really had a passion for helping development teams be great. And the DevOps movement in our industry is in many ways a continuation of the passions of the Agile movement. And we all want to build great software quickly with great quality, and we want to serve our customers and users really well. It's a very unselfish movement, and that's why I love it. It's not about us. It's about those paying for and using our software. We serve them. I have some industry news to go over and some tips, so why don't we go right into it? So first of all, Azure DevOps Server 2019 RC2 is available for download, and the link will be in the show notes. There's actually a blog post about it, but basically all of the features of Azure DevOps services have been released as a server version, so you can install it in your own data center. You can, if you're using GitHub Enterprise on premise, you can link work items with GitHub Enterprise, and you can do all the same things on Azure Boards, Azure Artifacts, Azure Pipelines, Azure Test Plans, Azure Repos, all the pull request flows. It's all there, and now you can get that on premise. There's a lot of changes that have been made with the transition from Visual Studio Team Services to Azure DevOps, and Azure DevOps Services being the cloud version. There's a very useful blog post by Matteo Emili, and that is basically on how to use the new URL scheme. And so, for instance, my company, clearmeasure.visualstudio.com was the URL. And of course, all the new URLs are dev.azure.com/clearmeasure, or whatever your org or account name is. If you go to your org overview settings page, there's a little switch to use the new URL scheme. And so if you have an instance that's older than September of 2018, you'll probably want to go and switch that setting so that you can use the new URL scheme. Of course, if you've just created a new org, then you're just there from default, and you don't even have to worry about it. Okay, other industry news is around incident management and change control. So ServiceNow is a product that is pretty big in the change management space, and so they have done some investment and done some tight integration with Azure Pipelines, And there is a ServiceNow change management extension. So the big points are, if you are a ServiceNow user, or if you don't have a solution for change management or incident management knowledge base, you might want to check them out. And it integrates at the release gate level within Azure Pipelines, so that you can essentially have information coming from ServiceNow be a pre-deployment gate, and it can block the readiness of a deployment to an environment based on the status that's in ServiceNow. In addition, you can add ServiceNow tasks in your deployment steps within Release Hub in Azure Pipelines. Your release configuration can have as many steps as you need to, and some of those steps can be updating a ServiceNow change request, and so that as it's deploying and as it's going from environment to environment, you can keep track of that in ServiceNow. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes. Also, next up is some information about Azure DevOps agents. So it's no secret, there's not a really clear solution at this point in time. Hopefully over this next year there will be. But there's no secret that the hosted pools in Azure Pipelines are kind of slow. And not that the servers themselves are kind of slow, because they're actually pretty generous servers. They're pretty fast. But when you have an absolutely clean server that's never even been hooked up to your Git repository before, in order to run any build configuration, it has to do a clone of your repository. Then it has to start running through your steps. Now, if you don't check in NuGet packages like the default is in Visual Studio, then invariably you're going to do a NuGet restore. And if you use npm packages, then you're going to pull all of those packages from npm as well. And that can take a little bit, even before you start doing any kind of compile or .NET.exe or MS build process. And so just to get to the point where you can start your actual build steps, you may be a minute and a half into your process, and that's just on small instances, and larger applications can be more than that. And so if you are coming from a situation where maybe you migrated from JetBrains TeamCity or had your own local build server, you may be used to builds that are a lot faster, and you go to the Azure DevOps services with hosted pools and you say, hey, why is this so slow? It's because you're doing a lot of repetitive work at the beginning of the process every time, and your dedicated build server that you used to have, well, it cloned the Git repository a while ago, and it was only doing a Git pull, which if it was only grabbing a few change sets was really fast. And on top of that, it wasn't having to do a full npm or NuGet restore, because it already had all the packages, and if there weren't any new ones, then that process finished pretty quickly. And then you immediately went on to your compilation step, and then some subsequent test steps after that. On top of that, the hosted pools, while they have a lot of things pre-installed, they don't have a SQL server installed. They don't have even SQL Express installed. And so that means that you either need to have your own database available for the build process, or you have to maybe spin up an Azure SQL database on the fly. And that can take time. Whereas if you have your own hosted build server on premise that you're used to, you probably just had a SQL server installed on it, whether it was Developer Edition or SQL Express Edition, if you wanted to make sure that you weren't accidentally using any features of SQL Enterprise without it being intentional. And so these restrictions of the hosted pools, if you really force yourself to use them, just add time to your build. And so there's really no built-in solution. And a lot of people are choosing to have their own dedicated build servers with the Azure DevOps agent installed on there. And you can just spin up a VM in Azure and, of course, spin it up and then turn it off at night or put it on a schedule. But then you still have to maintain the patches. And now you're maintaining an operating system. And in the cloud world, we don't want to be maintaining operating systems. We want the data center, essentially Azure, to do it for us. I don't want to patch any servers. I know that you listeners don't want to do that. So there's an interesting blog post upon blogs.msdn.microsoft.com. We'll include the link in the show notes about hosting the Azure DevOps agent on Azure container instances in Azure App Service. And so what this article does is essentially walk through how to configure the PowerShell to automatically spin up a Windows container, register it with Docker, spin it up, and install the agent and have it available to run your builds and then destroy it so that you can host it in Azure, you can scale it out, but you actually have the full power of the full operating system, because as a Windows container, you the code actually thinks it's running on the full operating system, even though it's just a slice. And so then you essentially have your own dedicated private build agent as far as Azure DevOps is concerned. And then you can cache your Git repository, cache NuGet, NPM, and you can actually speed up your builds. We're hoping that the hosted pools continue to innovate and get better. Through some conversations that I've had, I think that is happening. And I know there's been some public statements around that, but I think come back and keep tabs on that. But every part is continuing to innovate, and the hosted pools, I think, are no exception. I mean, already just in the past year, I think different options. I mean, Mac OS. How crazy is that there's Mac OS build agents? So that's pretty cool. All right, next item is .NET Core 3. And that's coming out sometime 2019, has been told. And that is going to be a phenomenal release. And mostly because I think that is the release where you can say, you know what, any new application you're building, by and large, do it with .NET Core 3. With .NET Core 1, and 2, there were some capabilities where we had to advise clients, no, let's stick with .NET Framework. For instance, integrating with a Visio diagram and Visio desktop. They have really good .NET Framework support, but not .NET Core yet. And so really your dependencies are going to make your decision for you. But with .NET Core 3, by the way, the preview 1 is out, and Visual Studio 2019 preview is out that includes it. It includes desktop support. WinForms and WPF are available. The tooling is still being refined, but it's there. And these desktop frameworks are being open sourced as well, so you can see the code. Around .NET Core 3, .NET 4.8 is going to come out with similar timing. And so even if you have an older desktop application with WinForms and WPF, which there's a lot of them out there, and I've done tons of desktop development. It's really interesting how some of the desktop patterns have been coming to the web. For instance, the bus pattern for having user elements notify other elements in the screen, how you can have something happen on one side of the screen, and up in the top menu, and a menu item knows to disable itself based on the context. That's because there was a bus pattern, and messages were constantly flowing over the bus pattern. And now, interestingly enough, there's lots of talk in the web community about using a bus pattern, which architecturally is hub and spoke. And there's a few popular libraries out there. There's it's actually pretty old now, the MVC contrib .bus library, and then there came the short bus library, and then the mediator library, but they're all implementations of the bus pattern, and that pattern is very, very common in desktop applications because you have lots going on in the screen. And so I think it's really interesting that's catching on a lot in all kinds of different applications. But either way, WinForms and WPF, .NET Core 3, bring them forward. And you can already do this, but there's a bridge with .NET Framework and .NET Core. If you're at least on .NET 4.6.2 right now, then you can compile for .NET Standard 2, which .NET Core 2 is .NET Standard 2. And if you do that, then you can start taking advantage of .NET Core libraries in your .NET Framework application. For instance, I think probably the most common, most useful would be that if you take your regular .NET Framework application, if you can get it up to at least .NET 4.6.2, then you can start making use of Entity Framework Core version 2. And then, of course, when .NET 3 comes out, Entity Framework Core 3 has, I think, a lot of the missing features that some advanced schemas and advanced domain models are needing, but you can bridge across. So you don't necessarily have to bring your entire .NET Framework application over to .NET Core, but if you just get up above .NET 4.6.2, and then, of course, if you can get up to there, I'm sure that you can get up to .NET 4.8 and then bridge over to .NET Core. So you can still compile and deploy on .NET Framework, but you can make use of all of the libraries that are coming out that are targeting .NET Core 3. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are interested in checking out a WPF app that is built on .NET Core 3, then just go ahead and search for the NuGet Package Explorer version 5. And if you deal in NuGet packages or package up your applications with NuGet packages, like we do all the time, it's very easy to just double click on a NuGet package. NuGet Package Explorer comes up and you can browse around and explore what's in there. If you don't have that, then you're left renaming it to a .zip file and then opening it as a zip file. But if you are not using the NuGet Package Explorer, then you should, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So there's an interesting strategy announcement, or it's kind of explicit, but you can also infer some in the AI space. So the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, has made it clear the strategy of Cortana. And they said it's an app. It's not a direct competitor to the various devices on the market. And the strategy is not to be a device, but an app or a skill for the other devices. And I think that's consistent with Microsoft's longtime software strategy to be compatible with many form factors of hardware. And even if they do offer some hardware, it's not that their stuff can only run on their hardware, but that the software is the differentiator and the software is meant to run in many different places. And so that's interesting to me because I've developed some Cortana-enabled skills, and it uses the bot framework. And so from a DevOps perspective, if you develop a speech-enabled AI app, you're going to integrate with the Cortana capabilities. And really, they're just web applications. And they use the bot framework, which you pull in from NuGet. And so the DevOps experience for this voice-controlled artificial intelligence app is really the same experience as any other ASP.NET MVC app, and with the database of your choice. I mean, you don't have to have a database, or you could store data wherever you like. But you have this web application, and then you deploy it to an Azure app service. And so you can set up a continuous integration build, go over to the release hub, set up a continuous delivery pipeline. And in that pipeline in your build, you can run your unit tests, integration tests, you can deploy, you can run full system tests calling the REST APIs of the bot framework. And then, of course, you're packaging your app, your Cortana bot, essentially, as a NuGet package. You're stuffing it in Azure Artifacts. And then with the release configuration across a series of environments, each of those will deploy to an Azure app service for the environment, and you just move it along. And a little bit of registration that you have to register for the bot framework through the website, but that's a one-time thing. And essentially, you have a complete DevOps experience for your speech-enabled AI bot. So that's pretty interesting. And with that strategy, I'm still waiting for the tooling to come across for it to be really easy to essentially develop for Cortana, host it in Azure, and then expose it and light it up in Alexa apps or Google Home. So that'll be kind of interesting. And as I said the name, my Echo kind of lit up listening for what else I was going to say. And one of the interesting things that one of our developers did last year at ClearMeasure was create a Alexa skill that would allow the logging of time. Because as we do projects to implement DevOps pipelines and deliver various software applications, of course we log time. And that was an interesting skill. All right, next up is information about Razor components. So I want to highlight an article that's actually put out by Progress Telerik on their blog. It's Razor components for a JavaScript free front end in 2019, and you can go to the telerik.com blogs. But they do a good job of going through the differences between Blazor and Razor components. But I'm going to give my take on it, and I encourage you to look at the show notes and go read that article. But my take on it is looking at all these SPA frameworks or single page application frameworks and recognizing them for what they are. And that is a reaction against web pages or websites that have been made into dynamic applications. And if I just kind of take myself back in time, my first programming job was in 1997. That's 21 and a half years ago. And I was developing really early web applications, and it was on Windows servers, IIS, interestingly enough, on top of SQL Server at the time. And it was the technology that predated active server pages. It was IDC with HTX templates. IDC stood for Internet Database Connector, and we were able to run a SQL statement against a ODBC data source and then get the results back and loop through it and format some HTML. And it had the code nugget that active server pages inherited, but you had a loop structure, you had an if structure, you had a record count structure, and then you could run a query. And that was just about all you had. And then you could redirect to a different URL. And so we did some interesting things, and then active server pages kind of took it further. But then I noticed, those web pages went from page to page to page. You had full screen refresh, and web forms, tried to kind of hide the refresh, and then Ajax came along and tried to hide the refresh even more. All the while, desktop applications were very stateful, and you brought up the UI once, and when you clicked on a button, only the section of the screen that needed to change actually changed. And so in the web, as the web applications got more and more complex, people like speed. And when you can take advantage of caching, of saving the state, then you get speed. If you have to refresh more than is actually necessary, then inherently you have some drag on the system, and it's going to be a little bit slower. And so SPA applications, it's natural that everybody wants that type of experience because they want the software to be really, really fast. And that's another reason why I don't think there'll ever be an operating system that's just a web page screen, because you have to, there's so much that benefits from just the concept of caching and not having to reload across the network connection or have to re-render all the time. And so desktop applications provide that really, really fast experience, and just native applications in general, whether it be on the iPhone, the Android. If you have a native application, it's going to be really, really fast because it's only sending data over the network instead of sending just the entire user interface. And so Angular and React and those have gotten a lot of adoption, and rightly so. But Angular is very complex. There's so many different concepts that you have to master, and it continues to change and it hasn't settled down. And so a lot of developers are looking for consistency, and they're looking for a Visual Studio solution where they can have as few of differing technologies as possible. And so, you can marry up an Angular application or a React.js application with a .NET backend. That's just fine, and people can do it. But it's almost like there's two different worlds living in the same application. And then invariably you have a few people on the team that are the front end people and a few people on the team that are the back end people. And it kind of creates this divide because the technologies and patterns are so different that it is not as common to find people that are equally skilled at both. And so along comes Blazor, which builds on the WebAssembly notion of a kind of interpreter or runtime in the browser that can essentially run C# in the browser. And that's, mind blowing because, wow, if I can run C# in the browser, if I have a C# runtime in the browser, then now I can do anything statefully in the browser with the same technology, same skill set as any other code in the Visual Studio application. And that is still under development. But what has been developed is Blazor server-side. Now, Blazor server-side has kind of been renamed to Razor Components, which is a little bit confusing because Razor was the templating syntax for ASP.NET MVC, and now there's Razor Pages that if you go back 20 years, it's kind of like a replacement for active server pages before ASP.NET came around. You can have Razor Pages have a website without any of the MVC components, or you can use Razor format as the views for your MVC application. And now we have Razor Components, which is a completely different paradigm. Razor Components is a competitor to Angular and is a competitor to React.js. And so that's really interesting because the same .NET developer skill sets now allow you to make a SPA application, a stateful, rich user experience in the browser without having to pull in all these different technologies. Now, Razor Components architecturally uses SignalR to go back and forth to the backend on the server. And so you can use the SignalR service in Azure for scalability. But I encourage you to check that out. We'll include the link in the show notes. And I believe Razor Components is going to come out with Visual Studio 2019 as GA unless they've broken that dependency. But that is huge for .NET developers. And if you're contemplating a brand new web application now and you're thinking about going React.js or you're thinking about going Angular, really research Razor Components, because if you can leverage your team's existing skill set for a rich, stateful web application with a consistent set of technologies in that Visual Studio solution, then you are going to go so fast. I've seen teams, trying to adopt React.js or Angular for the first time, long-time .NET teams, and it's such a different paradigm. They lose a lot of schedule time, and they don't really understand the paradigm risk going into it because these are popular, let me adopt them, and then it takes a lot of time, and it's just the reality for a lot of developers. And of course, front-end developers that maybe started your career with JavaScript or listening to me say that and say, no, it's easy. But it's just what you know, and there's tons and tons of .NET shops out there, and so you need to, if you're leading a team like that, you need to think about it. All right, the next thing I want to point you to is actually a recording. I mentioned the Azure DevOps User Group, which was the Microsoft DevOps User Group, and it was started back in late 2007. By the way, it's a virtual user group. You can attend from wherever you are and watch past presentations, including the kickoff presentation. Actually, the kickoff presentation was in January of 2018 when the group was called the Microsoft DevOps User Group, and Brian Harry presented. And Brian Harry was the corporate vice president in charge of all of Visual Studio Team Services, and he actually started the strategic movement to break up the product and rebrand it to align with Azure, and then he kind of transitioned out and executed a succession plan. But we're going to include a link to that in the show notes because that is recorded and you can watch that, and it's a really good presentation. And I want to close this with some tips, and I want to share 10 steps for rapidly recovering when a deployment breaks badly. We've all had a deployment go wrong. You think you practice, and it's even automated, but for some reason it failed and it's broken, and now you need to recover. And because it failed, you weren't expecting it to fail. You don't necessarily know what's going on. So the first tip when a deployment breaks badly is don't try to fix it on the fly. Every step in software should be small and reversible, and we all make mistakes when we try to fix things on the fly. In fact, research by Capers-Jones shows that for all defects in a software system, almost 10% of them come from bad fixes. And a failed deployment is one of the most stressful situations for attempting an ad hoc fix. So the first tip is not to try to fix it on the fly. The second tip is prioritize the preservation of your data. When the system is back up, users and customers, they need to trust the system. And this means losing no data. And it's one thing that a deployment went badly and that you incurred an outage. It's an entirely different thing if you lose data. And you won't know what data was lost. And every customer or user segment will be triaging on their own what records they lost, and they won't necessarily be sure about what they lost. Even if you declare, all data or transactions after a certain time frame, it'll still be hard to figure that out. So take another backup of your data stores immediately, along with the pre-deployment backup, and you'll be able to set the system right again. So the third tip is to communicate quickly and honestly. You need to devote all of your energy to fixing the system, and by proactively communicating, your customers will let you work. If you don't proactively communicate, your customers will find out when the system isn't back up in time, and they'll demand more communication because now they're surprised and now they're not sure what to expect. And they will demand more of your time and thereby disrupting the recovery effort. Tip number 4 is to begin data restores right away because they typically take a long time. Even if you have to restore 2 separate databases side by side, the new one, you need to begin this process quickly. It typically takes a while to restore data if that's been corrupted. And if you can be certain that data was not impacted, well, then you're ahead of the game there. Tip number 5 is communicate every step as you take it. Now there's, another one about communication. Communicate every step as you take it. And communicate the reasons why you are taking that step. If you have an online status page, make sure that you're truthful. It does no good to have a status page that's vague or promises an update at a certain time that's already come long ago. And this will save you time processing inquiries. Again, you want your customers to let you work. So by proactively communicating what you're doing and why, then you'll encourage more of them to just let you work. Tip number 6 is make the application function in a basic way first, and then restore the high scale configuration. If you have multiple nodes in a web farm, for example, or are distributed across lots of different servers, focus on making the previous version of the application function properly first, just from a functional perspective with a few transactions. Once that's accomplished, then you can replace the high scale or the high throughput characteristics. If you attempt to keep the throughput going, and if you attempt to put a high traffic or high level of traffic on the application too early, then you could likely cause it to fail because of overload, and you won't know the root cause right away because of that. And that would, of course, cause further delays. Tip number 7 is to recreate your environments. If you have no idea what happened, it's down, you tried one thing, then recreate the environments. Don't be afraid of that. New servers in this situation may be quicker to configure then figuring out why the existing servers have a bad configuration. And of course, if you have implemented infrastructure as code patterns, then you're going to have the scripts to be able to provision new servers quickly, and you're going to be in a really good spot. You can often do this in parallel. If you don't know if it's going to be quicker to fix the configuration of existing servers or environments or to recreate, you can just try it in parallel and see who wins. I mean, when you're in this type of situation, you need to be creative like that because it wasn't what you planned. Tip number 8 is learn from your experience. Now that you've restored the system, learn from your experience. Be brutally honest with yourself, with your team, and analyze what took the longest in the recovery. Practice recovering from these types of failures in a pre-production environment in the future. And then bake into your process a new quality control tactic that ensures the root cause of the failure here is prevented in the future, and that any version of software can be stood up at any time quickly. So really, really bake in the learning. Tip number 9 is don't trust the same automated deployment process that just failed to then properly conduct a rollback. So here's the scenario. Let's say you have an automated deployment, and especially very common to have automated database migration scripts. And some database migration tools allow you to have a migrate forward and then a migrate backwards, or a rollback script. And so if your deployment does have some type of rollback capability, you typically don't use it a lot, but hey, say it's there, but it's been working for a while, and then the deployment fails. So now the process that you just relied on in order to deploy the next version of the system, it just failed. So logically, how can we then trust it to do the right thing in order to roll it back and do things properly? It just architecturally and logically, that premise is flawed. If it just failed, then we can't trust it to somehow put it back in place. So don't expect to trust that same automated deployment process to do a rollback. And typically rollbacks are not automated. Roll forward is the way a DevOps pipeline is designed to go. All right, and then the 10th tip is to set a team vision for how deployment should go and how long they should take. Be bold about this. Challenge your team to be able to do deployments in the middle of the day without your customers even noticing. Set a goal to be able to recreate an entire environment with the push of a button. By the way, if there ever was a silver bullet, this is that silver bullet. If you can recreate an entire environment with the push of a button, that's about the closest that you're going to get to being able to recover regardless of what happens. So, that's the 10 steps for rapid recovery when a deployment breaks badly. And just an announcement for what's coming up in the future, and kind of exciting on the schedule. An upcoming podcast guest is going to be Paul Stovall, and he is the founder and CEO of Octopus Deploy, which is a really popular deployment product and integrates fabulously into Azure pipelines to handle your most complex of deployment configurations. It's really amazing how little PowerShell you actually have to use whenever you use all of the capabilities in the library within Octopus Deploy, especially if you have some complex on-premise or cloud configurations, either one. And it has a version that you can install right next to Azure DevOps Server if you're on premise, or you can host it with the Cloud Edition if you're on Azure DevOps Services. So that's the information for today. All of this will be in the show notes. And I'm Jeffrey Palermo. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.